on the dot, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to CDOT headquarters if you haven't been here before. Just really quickly, because this presentation is tailored to CDOT a little bit, I think it'd be really important to introduce some key roles in our construction program. So our newest addition is Laura Newman. I don't know if you want to wave or... She is our MS4 program manager. Would that be the most appropriate title? Okay. Okay, cool. Construction program manager. Okay. And then we have Paul Heffernan. Paul? He knew he was going to get introduced. Very well. So Paul is our MS4 field, construction program field manager. So he plays a key role. He's going to be dealing a lot with the permit renewal as well. And then we have our water quality section manager, Jean Cordova. She is our subject matter expert. So along with those three wonderful people and Al, we can probably get through this process together. But I thought those introductions were important. So without further ado.
Awesome. Thank you, Tamara. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Al Stafford. I'm with the Water Quality Control Division over at the Department of Public Health and Environment. Specifically, I'm in the Clean Water Compliance Unit, and today we're going to be talking on the construction stormwater renewal. Thanks so much to CDOT for hosting this event today. We're doing a number of these all across the state, including a couple here in the metro area this week. And then we've been anywhere from Grand Junction, going down to Durango, up to Steamboat, so spreading far and making sure we educate as much as we can out there on this permit renewal. Quick intro for me. So I've been with the division for about 8 years now. Started out as a permit writer, did that for about 5 years. Did anything from wastewater treatment plants, and then eventually kind of settled into sand and gravel and hard rock mines. So that's where my original stormwater background came from, was in sand and gravel. And then also in the last 3 years, I've been with the Clean Water Compliance Unit, where we do inspections, primarily construction inspections throughout the state. So I've done about 200 inspections or so in the last 3 years. Quite a few familiar faces out there, so hi to those of you who I have met either in the field or in the office. Just to kind of get a read for the room, how many folks do we have in here who are GCs? Okay. How about regulators? A lone hand, hello. I see you. Who do we have in here from maintenance? Okay, great. Who does construction inspections for sites? A number of folks. Awesome. Great. Excellent. Well, I'm sure if you didn't raise your hand, I know that your role is equally important. Sorry I didn't include you in the list there. But welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for being here today. So we'll get right started onto our agenda here. As you can see, we're going to start out just talking about permits in general for the specifically for the construction sector. Then we'll dive right into the meat and potatoes of the program here today, which are changes in that construction stormwater permit and what those requirements are. We'll take a look at the stormwater management plan and as well as the site inspections, see what updates are needed in all of those, paperwork kind of side of things. And then also we're going to talk about the administrative requirements and changes, including the online application process, or CIOS. I know there's a lot of great questions about that out there, so we'll talk about it a little bit within the program, and then we'll also have plenty of time at the end for any questions that you have. We've got the room for a bit, so we'll be able to have any large discussions that are needed, and then I'll also be available for questions after. And to end up the presentation today, I want to make sure that you all know about the available resources that are out there for everyone, including our Stormwater Management Plan guidance document. So construction permits, what do we have here in the state? As you can see, our construction stormwater permit is by and large our largest permit. Throughout the entire CDPHE's permits, throughout the Water Quality Control Division's permits, our next largest number of permits fall under our industrial stormwater permit, which only has about 1,000 permits. So you can see that construction stormwater permit is about 5-fold from even our next largest sector. We have about 4,800 permits currently in the state under our construction stormwater permit, and we get about 2,400 applications per year. So you can see it's a large volume of permits coming in and out all the time. Also under our construction that we won't be talking about as much today is our dewatering permit. We currently have about 250 of those with about 230 applications coming in a year. So those are definitely high turnover projects. They tend to only be when a site needs to dewater for a small amount of time. Our remediation permits tend to stick around a little bit longer. Those are typically down here in the Denver metro area. That's when your groundwater that you're having to pump out meets certain exceeds certain water quality standards. We also have our city and county MS4s. Got about 64 of those right now. That would be such as City of Denver, Weld County, things like that. And then also our non-standard MS4s. That would include CDOT here, as well as our universities, things such as that. So how do construction permits work? How do they work down the chain in the Water Quality Control Division? Well, we start out with our permit sector. And the permit section, they write all of the permits and issue all the certifications that come underneath those permits. So they're the folks you deal with in the application process, modifications, transfers, things such as that. That all falls underneath our permit section. Then we move on, once the permit's issued, then we move on over to our compliance and enforcement section. Now this is actually broken down into two different groups so that we always have a check and balance between compliance and enforcement. There's always other folks looking at these inspection reports. So the compliance unit, which is what I'm a part of, the Clean Water Compliance Unit, we conduct inspections throughout the state and also do assistance in education, such as this project here, and help out with trainings at Red Rocks Community College, and also give a number of presentations when they're requested throughout the year. We currently have about 9 FTE, and about 80% of that is dedicated to construction. So you can see that we have a large percentage that we really do focus on construction. Part of that is because of the large number of permits, and then also because of our alternative compliance strategy, where we actually have a 10% oversight for the construction sector, whereas many of our other sectors have more of a 2 to 3% oversight. So what happens after that, when we have an inspection that was conducted, if it meets our formal enforcement criteria, that moves on to a different into a different unit. And then our enforcement team takes over. Now they're in charge of our formal enforcement, and they also do all the compliance oversight for our DMRs. That would be if you have a construction store or a dewatering or a remediation permit. So why did we need to renew the construction general permit? Well, first of all, as a delegated state, the EPA requires that Colorado renews their permits every 5 years. This permit has been administratively extended, so the 5 years was up in 2012. So we're going on a pretty long time since that date that we're still kind of limping along on this permit that doesn't necessarily meet the EPA's requirements. So the EPA has their own construction general permit. And then the state permit has to include all of the pieces and the intent of that EPA permit. And so we get the effluent limitation guidelines, or ELGs. Those get filtered down from the EPA permit down into the state permit. So you can see our first public notice was back in October of 2016. That was a couple months worth of public notice there. We received a very large volume of comments. During that time, we also had a stakeholder meeting, which really we were trying to make sure that the construction sector participated in this permit renewal process as much as possible. And so that stakeholder meeting, we were able to get an understanding of some of the concerns, some of the kind of hot topics that might come up in the renewal process. We actually had to put the permit to a second public notice. And the reason for this was we realized that the part 2 of the permit, which includes a lot of those kind of the more legal notifications, signature requirements, those didn't meet the EPA requirements. And so we had to go back through and just update that part 2 of the permit. And that's what that second renewal, second public notice was for. So the permit was finally issued on November 1st of 2018, just this past November. And then there's 6 months in between the issue date and the effective date. And what that allows us to do is, first of all, bring our online application system up to speed. And we'll get more into that toward the end of the presentation. And then we also want to make sure everyone had time to get their stormwater management plans up to date. And we'll talk about what those requirements are in the presentation as well. So basically, end of the story is, on April 1st, which our permit writer always says, April Fools, on April 1st, those permits, those stormwater management plans, and your site conditions need to meet the current permit requirements, so the renewal permit requirements. Just to take a look at the overall goal of the permit, so here's the big thing. The overall goal of the permit hasn't changed. At the end of the day, we're still making sure that we protect our pollutant sources that are associated with construction activity and make sure that we're not discharging pollutants off-site. We're doing that via stormwater management plan, doing it via practice-based effluent limitations. So instead of taking a sample and having numeric effluent limitations like we do for our dewatering, instead we're using practice-based effluent limitations. So it's practices that we need to do on site. And so at the end of the day, that hasn't changed. We're still doing the same thing. We're still going to be using silt fence. We're still going to use straw wattle. At the end of the day, management of the site has not changed. So let's talk about now what has changed. A few comprehensive changes to talk about first off. First of all, there is a new permit number, so new permit ID. That means that everyone will get a new certification, and your certification number, instead of starting with COR 03, will now start with COR 40. The only thing there is we ran out of numbers. There was too much construction. There is a reformatting of the permit. So you'll see as you read through it, I guess I should ask, instead of saying who has anyone read the permit? The new permit? Handful? Excellent. That's better than I've seen at my other trainings. Way to go, CDOT. So you'll see there's a bit of a reformatting in the permit, trying to get it a little more comprehensive, a little more understandable, putting the requirements that go together. There used to be 4 different places, 5 different places where it talked about concrete washout. Now all of that is in one location. We've also gone ahead and removed any duplicative requirements. The main one here is going to be our discharges to construction dewatering discharges to the ground. And we'll talk about that in just a couple slides here. Also, we're making sure, like I was talking about, we're incorporating all those federal effluent limitation guidelines, those ELGs, those things from the EPA that we have to put into our permit. You'll also notice a terminology change. So where we used to see BMP, or best management practice, now we're using the term control measure. Control measure is kind of a larger umbrella term for BMP. It really makes sure that it includes all of the various ways that we manage stormwater on site. So our scheduling, our education training, as well as our kind of traditional, structural control measures. Last thing to note here too, this is just kind of neat. So if you're reading through the permit on a computer, the first time that any of our main definitions come up, they'll be in blue text. Excuse me, and you can you can click on those and it'll pop you down to the glossary for the permit, which is just super helpful, not having to shuffle back and forth. New technology. So at the end of the day, coverage under the permit hasn't really changed. We're still covering construction activity under the permit. We're still covering those support activities, your borrow and fill sites that are associated with that facility, the dedicated asphalt and concrete batch plants that are associated with that facility. We've also made sure now to include our masonry mixing sites, which have always been included more or less. They are known pollutant sources on construction sites. It just wasn't specified in the permit previously, and so it's really just for clarity there. Keep in mind too that this also includes all of our construction at oil and gas operations. They do fall under our construction permit during that construction period, and then also includes at various mines or other facilities, industrial facilities that are having construction occurring outside of their typical industrial activity. Let's say a sand and gravel mine is having a new way station put in. That would and it fell under over an acre of disturbance. That would fall, as well as need a sand and gravel permit, would also need a construction stormwater permit. So as far as allowable discharges of non-stormwater, the top 4 bullets there are really the same. Those are the same from our old permit, nothing new there. One thing to point out, and just going forward here, you'll see that the major changes are going to be in yellow, by the way. So one thing that we've taken out is that construction dewatering discharges to ground. Now the thing is, there's no actual change regarding site operation here. This is still an allowable discharge. It's simply that it also falls under the division's low-risk discharge policy. And so this is what I was talking about with those duplicative requirements, that it's already covered under, it's already said to be a low-risk discharge. We didn't need it in the construction permit as well. So no change to actual overall operation there. So control measure requirements. The big change here is our term minimize. So we are required to implement control measures, which we had to do before, but now we're going to be minimizing the discharge of pollutants from all potential pollutant sources. And so the idea here, the term minimize, we know that we can't eliminate all sediment from leaving the site. There's always going to be some discharge from the site. And so what we want to do is minimize that discharge. And minimize, as you can see from the definition up here, we're going to reduce or eliminate to the extent achievable. And that's with control measures that are technologically available and economically practical in light of best industry practices. So what sorts of things does that mean for construction sites for sediment? Well, it means our silt fence. It means our erosion logs. It means sediment basins. These same control measures that we're seeing already out there in the field. That's what we use to minimize pollutant sources from construction sites, because that's our current industry best practices. So we'll see from the top one here, this is the old familiar. Control measures have to be selected, designed, installed, and maintained in accordance with good engineering, hydrologic, and pollution control practices. Same exact languages from the previous permit. Another thing here is that control measures need to be installed prior to the start of construction or disturbance. And this really just provides clarity here, right? We always knew that we had to implement control measures prior to construction disturbance. Otherwise, we had construction without control measures, and that wasn't allowed previously. So we're just adding clarity there. And we already know, too, in phasing, that we always included that in our phasing descriptions. We always said we were going to, in our stormwater management plan, we always said we were going to put in control measures prior to construction. Now we're just clarifying it in the permit there. A couple more requirements for control measures. These are specifically for erosion and sediment now. So stormwater runoff must flow to at least one control measure to minimize sediment. Again, clarification from previously. We said we have to implement control measures for all pollutant sources. Now we're just saying they have to go to at least one control measure. Now they also must contain or filter flows to prevent bypass without treatment. And so what's important here is when we put those two bullets together, what we find is that we can't use inlet protection as a sole control measure. And now this was already the case, right? We know that we can't have areas of disturbance that just go to inlet protection, because inlet protection, in order to function, needs to be able to overtop or to bypass. And so then we were having potential for sediment leaving the site over that inlet protection. And so this is something that we've always called out in our inspections with the Clean Water Compliance Unit. Now we're just putting more clarity into that permit. So we need to go to at least one control measure, but it needs to be able to contain those flows. And so inlet protection can't be our only control measure there. So our control measures have to be appropriate for the disturbed areas and for the expected flow conditions, and they need to be adequately sized. So a couple examples here. First of all, we just talked about inlet protection. So inlet protection is not appropriate as the sole control measure because it has to be able to bypass. And so we see there that inlet protection can't be our sole control measure because it's not appropriate. Another example would be our sediment basins. So our sediment basins need to be appropriately sized and adequately sized for all of the potential flow coming to that site. Let's say that the site itself is only an acre, but perhaps we have 2 acres of parking lot and roofs that are just up gradient of there that run onto our site. Well, our sediment basin needs to be able to handle the flow not just from our disturbed area, but also that run-on that's coming onto the site if we're not handling it otherwise. Another example here would be our silt fence or our erosion logs. So the specification for those 2 control measures requires that we have only half an acre of disturbance up gradient of 100 lineal feet of silt fence or of straw wattle. And so again, we want to make sure that it's adequately sized, that it's appropriate for the flow conditions coming to that control measure. So again here, we're adding clarity. No actual changes. It was already in the specifications. We knew we had to implement appropriate control measures that followed good engineering, hydrologic, and pollution control practices. Now we're just clarifying. Looking at vehicle tracking controls specifically, we already knew we had to implement vehicle tracking controls previously because it was part of our requirements for our stormwater management plan. So it's not actually a change, again, in what we're doing on the site. We know we have to do this. Now it's just in the permit rather than just in our stormwater management plan. One thing that is different here, though, is that we can ensure that areas where tracking does occur, it flows to one control measure instead of having a vehicle tracking control. And so what this is saying here, the change that allows a little more flexibility in the sector, is that we actually can have some amount of tracking as long as it's coming back into a control measure. Again, though, remember that inlet protection cannot be the sole control measure, including for that tracking. And so perhaps it comes back into a lined ditch with check dams, that sort of thing. That's what we're looking at there. Inlet protection cannot be the sole control measure there. Another requirement for our control measures for erosion and sediment control is that for sediment basins, we need to now make sure that our inlets, that our outlets withdraw water from at or near the surface when they're discharging from our basins, from our impoundments. And we'll talk about that word unless infeasible in a second here. But what does that mean? What does that look like in the field? It could look like a skimmer. Could also look like a slotted riser pipe, perforated pipe, something like that. The idea is that we want that water to be able to build up so that the sediment settles to the bottom and we're not sucking out from the bottom of the basin. Now again, no actual change here really, because previously we needed to make sure if we were using a sediment basin as our final control measure, if it was during the construction activity, so we know that sediment basins, water quality ponds, we don't need additional control measures in those once we don't have disturbance. But during the construction phase, we want to make sure that that basin is somehow modified. So perhaps there was a concrete trickle pan down the middle of the basin. Well, in order to modify that, we'd want maybe rock socks placed at a certain interval along that trickle pan, and then also some sort of outlet protection. So looking at it from that perspective, again, not really a change in what needed to occur, more of clarity in the permit. So let's look, though, going back here, we see a new term similar to minimize that's new in the permit here, and that's unless infeasible. So let's look at what infeasible is. So infeasible would be not technologically possible or not economically practical and achievable in light of best industry practices. So let's go back to this last example here with the skimmer. Now, if in order to have a skimmer, we need to have a generator, we need to have some sort of electricity going to that skimmer, well, in that case, that might not qualify as economically practical in this situation. And so in that particular sediment basin, maybe we want to see that slotted riser pipe or something like that. Another one of our requirements now for erosion and sediment control is that we have to maintain pre-existing vegetation or equivalent control measures for 50 feet, horizontal feet to the receiving waters. And again, we see that term unless infeasible. Now, this one came directly from the EPA. This is one of those ELGs from them that we were required to implement. Let's talk about what unfeasible might mean in this situation. Let's say we're doing stream bank restoration from the 2013 flood. Well, if we're intentionally disturbing the entire area down to the river, then it's not feasible to maintain that 50-foot buffer. Let's say that we have a site that's already existing, right? Today, it exists today. They've already graded down to the river because this permit isn't active yet. Well, in that case, again, it's not feasible to grow that vegetation back. It's already happened. It's kind of grandfathered in there. Another instance, let's say that we have a subdivision and we'd lose a certain amount of value if we're not able to grade closer than 50 feet to our receiving water. That might, again, calculate out as being infeasible. I'm sorry, not calculate out, but be able to be qualified as being infeasible. Another one here is minimize soil compaction, where you're going to be using infiltration or where your final stabilization is going to be some sort of vegetation. Now this one, again, it really adds clarity. It is an EPA ELG that was required. It already made a lot of sense and was in a lot of stormwater management plans that we should reduce soil compaction, especially because if we were going to use infiltration and we compact that soil, we're not going to get that infiltration rate anymore. Now the soil's compacted, there's no space for that water to get in. Also, we might, we've always known that we want to minimize compaction when we're going to be using vegetation as our final stabilization, because if we compact that soil, that root system's not going to be able to get in there. We're not going to get as good a seeding as we would like. Oh, and going back to this, so how do we minimize soil compaction? Well, we minimize site access where possible. So if we know that we're not going to be working in these lots over here or on this stretch of the highway over here for the next 10 days, then we know, okay, let's not drive on it while we don't have to drive on it. Another one here, unless infeasible, you're going to preserve your topsoil for areas that are going to be vegetated for final stabilization. This was already a requirement, again, in a lot of stormwater management plans. COGCC requires it in the oil and gas field. Now, what would be infeasible in this situation? Well, let's say we're not going to use topsoil. Well, in that case, it's infeasible to keep your topsoil around. Let's say that your topsoil is incredibly rocky or very, very sandy and isn't going to be able to grow the vegetation that you're going to need there. Well, in that case, again, it's infeasible to maintain that topsoil. And this is another one that came from those EPA ELGs. This one here, I know that CDOT's made some changes to their specifications regarding the amount of soil that can be exposed at any time. I know that CDOT already has some requirements in the amount of acreage that you can have open and that you need waivers for more of that. And so this is in line with that idea there. Again, not really a new requirement. It was already something that was in the majority of stormwater management plans. How did it look? Well, it looked like phasing. We minimize the amount of disturbance by phasing that project, doing just pieces at a time. And that's going to include especially your steep slopes there. Now, if we're not able to implement phasing, then we're going to look to temporary stabilization. So if we can't break this up so that we're only working on sections in 2-week increments or so, that's when we're going to look into our temporary stabilization. And so we want to make sure that we're implementing that whenever construction has ceased for at least 14 days. What does that look like? Let's see a couple different examples we've got up here. One would be mulching. So getting your straw mulch, your wood mulch down, making sure that that's installed properly, it's crimped into the soil, all of that good stuff. We see terracing down here on the right. It's hard to see in that photo there, but basically creating your benches for you. Tracking is another is another great temporary stabilization method. Now, some folks say, wait, but you said we can't compact the soil. Well, running a track over at one time is still in line with minimizing your compaction. Another option there would be your surface roughening, so grooving, tracking, disking, things like that. Now, getting away from our temporary stabilization over into our final stabilization. So final stabilization has to be installed and designed as a permanent feature. That might be your riprap channels, things like that. Also, think about rather than a temporary seed mix, which often results in quite a few weeds, we're looking for a permanent seed mix. So more of that native seed mix, what's really going to stay there and last. Another requirement is we want to make sure we remove all our temporary control measures unless otherwise specified. Obviously, our erosion control blankets, we're not going to rip those out. The point is for the vegetation to grow through those. But we're talking about silt fence, and really that was already a requirement in the permit previously because we only wanted to implement the control measures that were doing something in the field. Otherwise, we needed to be taking those out because we run into waste management issues. Now, our concrete washout areas, this part here hasn't changed at all. We have to implement control measures for concrete washout, and we can't let that concrete washout get to any of our runoff or our receiving waters. So we can't discharge that as stormwater. Now, we can still discharge concrete washout to the ground. And the previous permit really just said that we had to prevent pollution of groundwater. Wasn't very clear in exactly what that meant. So the renewal here, we have a little more clarity. Discharges have to flow through soil that has a buffering capacity prior to reaching that groundwater. Now, do we have a definition for buffering capacity? No. I think about it as if you're in a cobbly, sandy soil, that's not going to have as good a buffering capacity as you would in something more loamy. But overall, it's a judgment call. Concrete washout shall not be located where there's shallow groundwater. Are we defining shallow groundwater? No. But think about it again from a common sense. It's really the same as the previous permit. You know that if you went out there to dig your concrete washout pit 4 feet deep and you hit groundwater, that's shallow groundwater. If you know that you're right next to wetlands or a stream, chances are you have shallow groundwater. You're going to want to move that concrete washout further away. So again, previously we said you had to protect groundwater. Again, now we're just defining a little bit more what that really means. So those are our control measure requirements, our practice-based effluent limits that are in the permit. Now we're going to take a look at the documentation. So there's only really a few changes that we have to the stormwater management plan requirements. First of all, before we get into those changes too much, this is still a living document. We still want it to be maintained, kept up to date. It should reflect exactly the current field conditions. Now we want you also to maintain a record of those changes, and that's going to include a date and the identification of what that change is. There's two different ways you can do this. The first would be to keep some sort of log in the back of your stormwater management plan. Write down what the change is and the date that that change occurred, and then keep that current stormwater management plan in your book. The second way would be kind of what we typically see in the field, which is just going through and redlining. But now you're going to add a date to when those red lines occurred. That's how we're going to make sure we know kind of a documentation of the maintenance of this book. Same as previously, though somewhat misunderstood, the plan does need to be retained on site. If you're unable to retain the plan on site, let's say construction occurred 3 years ago and you're still waiting for the grass to grow out in Rangeley, then in that case, that stormwater management plan might not have a place to live on site, but it could live at the local maintenance office. And so what you just need to do there is get in touch with somebody from water quality, one of the inspectors, one of the permit writers in construction sector, and just have them just ask for permission to keep it off site, and we'll send you back a quick authorization, just an email saying that's all set, we'll add this to your file. But we do need that plan to be maintained on site unless you have that written authorization. And of course, same as before, that plan needs to be available on request. Typically, that would be for inspections, both MS4 inspections as well as the state ones. So our required content, not too much change right here. One thing that looks very different, but hasn't actually changed, is our qualified stormwater manager. Now, this previously used to be called our stormwater management plan administrator. It's the same idea here. All we're saying here is that the person needs to be somewhat knowledgeable in construction stormwater. Now, we're not defining what knowledgeable means. We're not requiring any trainings. We're not saying you have to go to this training or that training. But we are expecting that that person has an understanding of how stormwater works and that they're able to analyze how stormwater management is working in the field, which essentially is what that stormwater management plan administrator previously had to be required to do. Nothing new with our spill prevention, materials handling. Of course, we want to list out those potential sources of pollution. When it comes to our implementation of control measures, so that's where we look at our design specs, including our maintenance requirements and those descriptions. We also now want to have a use agreement whenever you have an off-site control measure. Let's say that it's discharging, we've got a subdivision that's got 6 builders and they're all going to the same sediment basin. You'd want to have a use agreement with whoever's maintaining that sediment basin. Same thing, let's say we've got an inlet, down the next intersection from our bridge project. Then in that case, you'd want some sort of use agreement if you're not the person or you're not the permittee who's taking care of that control measure. Our site description, we see a lot of familiar things up there. Most of that is the same. One thing that's different here is that we want in your stormwater management plan some sort of description on the method you used for calculating your percent vegetation density. So that's your pre-existing percent density. Again, we're not saying you have to use one method or another. You might use the hula hoop method. Some folks use transects. I've seen folks put together PVC kind of squares that they can toss. Whatever method you use, just have a brief description of what you're doing and how you're doing that to calculate that pre-existing vegetation. Of course, we want to see those receiving streams, nothing different there. Now also, though, if we've got any stream crossings, and this is a big one in the CDOT world for sure because we do so much bridge work. So all of those stream crossings that are located within our construction site boundary, we want a brief description on where those are, what is the receiving stream, what sort of construction is occurring in that area. Just a brief description of the area, a narrative description there. On our site map, again, not a lot of updates or changes here. A couple new things. Some of these we're already seeing in a lot of our CDOT plans anyway. Flow arrows, so we want to get our flow arrows on our maps, give us a better idea of how stormwater is moving on site. Kind of skipping down to the other changes here. So you can see, in addition to having all of our waters, so our springs, our streams, our wetlands, in addition to labeling where those are, we also want to show any area where we're maintaining that 50-foot setback from construction to the stream. So remember we had talked about that requirement for the EPA. We also want to indicate where that is on our map. We also, so we had talked about in our narrative, we want a description of our stream crossings. We're also going to label where those are on our map. And the thing is about the stream crossings and why that's in the permit now is those are really our crucial locations, right? That's where our construction comes right up to the river. We know that there's a high potential for discharge without adequate control measures in those locations. And so we really want to draw attention to those locations and really focus on those in our inspections and in our management of water on the site. So also within our stormwater management plan, we're going to list out what we're using for final stabilization. We've always had to do that. Always make sure you have your seed mix in there, whatever that's going to be. And best to have some sort of percentage in actual seed mix. If you know it's going to be a native seed mix, maybe some examples of what might be used in your plan. As a new addition here to the plan, we also want to see the plan practices that are going to be used after construction's completed. So in here we're talking about permanent riprap channels, sediment basins that are now water quality ponds, things such as that. So that wasn't a requirement of the permit previously. You used to be able to just say basically how you were going to achieve vegetation or non-disturbance. Now we also want to know how's stormwater going to work permanently on the site. So now we'll switch over to our site inspections. A couple of really great changes in here for sure. One thing is just we want to make sure that they're conducted by that qualified stormwater manager. Now you can have multiple, or a qualified stormwater manager. You can have multiple for one site. It can be a title, it can be a person, but you do want a qualified stormwater manager conducting those inspections. Again, this is someone knowledgeable in stormwater, so it makes sense that you would want someone who knows what they're looking at to be conducting the inspections. One change here, and this is some clarification, the previous permit didn't say when inspections needed to begin on site. Now we're saying you need to start them within those first 7 days. And remember that installing control measures is a form of construction activity. There is some form of disturbance that occurs in there. And so once we have those control measures on site, within those first 7 days, or once construction activity begins, if you began before control measures, which you shouldn't have, then you want to start it within those first 7 days. So here's one of the exciting changes in the permit that adds a lot of flexibility. We now have different options for the inspection frequency. And so our first option here, which is our new option, is that you can conduct site inspections every 7 days and not conduct any post-storm inspections. So that's option one. So that's conducting one inspection every 7 days, no post-storm. So that might work really well in a location where it rains a lot. Or it might work really well if you know that you have 20, 30, 40 different sites that you need to inspect, and there's no way you can do that when it rains really hard. But if you can get them all on a weekly schedule, then it's easier to maintain. So that gives you more flexibility there. Now remember here with our 7 days that stormwater doesn't take holidays, doesn't take vacations, doesn't take weekends. Stormwater happens anytime. And so 7 days is strictly 7 calendar days. If you know that there's, President's Day coming up and you usually inspect on Mondays, you're going to want to shift things around to accommodate for that. They need to be at least every 7 days. Now option number 2, so remember option number 1 was our 7 days, no post-storm. Now option number 2 is what we have currently in the permit, which is our 14 days, an inspection every 14 days, and then you're also going to conduct those post-storm inspections. Now this might work really well in the drier areas of the state. It might work really well if you know that you have the manpower to get behind the storm events. So again, you can choose though which one works best for your site. You can also choose to go back and forth. So let's say that during the rainy season you want to do 7-day inspections, and then during the summer or the drier season we're going to do every 14 and post storms. So you can make those options to go back and forth between the two. So lots of flexibility there. Yeah. Great question. And I'll get to your question back there in a second, Paul. So what we will, and we'll see this in a minute here, you want to include that in your inspection records, but it doesn't need to be in your plan itself. Yep. Question back there?
Paul Heffernan, I was introduced earlier, I was in the room. Just so everyone knows, CDOT is not changing from 7 days with post-storm. We're not with these options.
Thank you, Paul. That is a great question, and I do not. Other questions on the inspection frequencies? Yeah. You can. You can. You can. You just need to note it in your inspection records. And go forth. What was that? I'm sorry? Sure, that would be something you'd have to work out between the MS4 and between CDOT. That's true. Yep, that's true. And let's say you have one CDOT project and one that's not CDOT. You can do different things within your company too. Yep. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Thank you. I'm sorry to folks who are online if you're probably not hearing these. My apologies. I will repeat the question. Other questions on the inspection frequency? Great. I hope we were able to provide some clarity on that. I know that CDOT had given us some questions on why there were two frequencies. And it really is important. But do keep in mind you follow whatever your MS4 is requiring, whether that's CDOT or whether that's someone else. Yeah. But we at the state have given you flexibility. Another change here in our inspection frequencies. So if you have a site that's discharging to an outstanding waters, and you would know that from the fact sheet that comes with your certification, that site needs to conduct your site inspections every 7 calendar days. And so you're held to that 7-day schedule. No post-storms, but you are held to the 7-day schedule there. And just touch on that, so outstanding waters, if you work primarily here in the metro area, there are none. They're all up in the mountains. There are pristine kind of headwater areas. So a couple changes to our inspection reports. There's a few new requirements to include within your records. One is going to be your weather conditions at the time of the inspection. This can be real general. We don't need to have a whole meteorological, evaluation of the site. Sunny, cloudy, snowing. Obviously, if it's raining, that's an important one to put in there. Snow melt, things like that. An approximate temperature. Again, doesn't need to be, to the nearest 10th degree. We're just talking approximate here. We also want you to include your phase of construction. This, again, we aren't necessarily providing here the various potential phases. It's really up to you to decide what that means for your site. Things such as active construction, grading, final stabilization, vertical construction, landscaping. Those are the sorts of things we're looking at here. We want to see an estimated acreage of disturbance. So that's how much area is currently disturbed, not what you have on your permit, but the actual current disturbance. And you're not going to include areas here that have been finally stabilized. So you would include if it's seeded but hasn't grown. You would include if it has erosion control blanket, temporary stabilization, those mulching, tracking, things like that. But we're not going to include like our paved areas. We wouldn't include our building foundations. Once we've got that road in, we're not going to include that. And here's where we come back to that previous question. So we want a description of our minimum inspection frequency. So whatever we're using at that time, we want to have that included on our records here. And then obviously, same as before, if we're going to deviate from the minimum inspection schedule, we're talking here our winter exclusion, final stabilization, where you pop down to 30 days. And I'm not going to talk more about those just because nothing's changed there. Those are exactly the same. So those, you still want to note that, though, in your reports. So another couple things we need to see on our records, on our inspection reports, and this is similar to before, is we need to see the location of control measures that need maintenance, and then also the locations of inadequate control measures. So the difference here, we always knew we needed locations of where we needed to perform corrective actions. Now we're kind of breaking this into two different pieces. One is maintenance, and the other one is inadequate control measures. So let's look at what that really means. So we can see over on one side, we've got our inadequate control measure. This silt fence probably isn't going to make it if we have a major rain event. It wasn't really installed correctly. We've definitely had a lot of slumping up against it. We can see some of the stakes might be broken. It's inadequate. It's not going to make it through the next storm. Looking on the other side, and it's also, sorry, to go back to this, so inadequate, it's no longer in good engineering, hydrologic, or pollution control practices. So it's no longer installed in those categories correctly. It's not maintained. Maybe it wasn't designed correctly. Silt fence might not be the best choice for us. We obviously didn't install it also because we have no area from the toe. So think about that, good engineering, hydrologic, and pollution control practices. Now on the flip side, we see maintenance. Okay, we've got some slumping here, but overall that silt fence is still going to do what it needs to do. We know we need to maintain it because our spec says you shouldn't have slumping, but it's going to do what it needs to do. A little more detail on this because I want to make sure everyone sees the difference here. So maintenance, still operating in accordance with its design. It's still in good engineering, hydrologic, and pollution control practices. But it does require maintenance to prevent a breach, right? We know that if it were to rain over and over, at some point it's going to be too much. We need to do something to fix it. So the example here would be, now let's take our erosion log. And our specification says, once we reach 50% capacity, half the height, right, we need to maintain it. So if we're talking about maintenance, that would be if it's less than half the height. Let's say it's 49% high. Well, in that case, we need to dig it out, but if it were to rain again, we'd probably be okay, because it's still within our specification, which says it needs to be below half. But we also know we need to be preemptive here. We have to be proactive. Now, if we fall under those categories of just maintenance, we aren't subject to corrective action requirements. We need to note if we see an area that needs maintenance in our inspection, so while we're conducting an inspection, we need to note that in our inspection report. But there's other requirements for corrective actions. So let's take a look at that. So corrective actions need to be done on inadequate control measures. And that's going to be when the control measure is no longer designed or implemented or maintained in accordance with good engineering, hydrologic, pollution control practices. So let's take that erosion control log one more time, right? So now let's say that sediment's at 51%. And remember, this is theoretical. You're obviously not going to go out and measure in the fields. It's theoretical. Stick with me, though. So 51%. Now, our specification said we needed to maintain it before it hit 50%. So now it's inadequate. So 49%, it needed to be maintained. 51%, now it's inadequate. We need to do something about that. And what we need to do needs to occur immediately. That's what the new permit said. So previously, I'll get 1 second. Previously, we said as soon as possible, immediately in most cases. And now we're saying no, that needs to happen immediately. And we'll talk about in a second here if we can't get to it immediately. Yeah? Yeah.
And your last part of the treatment train has not reached being inadequate. Are you as DPHE looking at if any component is inadequate? Because I think you could argue, like if you're in series there, and you have the capacity in, say, your check dams that are going to go offsite, and as they're going offsite, they're all great, but there's one or two in the interior that are above that half height. I think this is
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the permit says that all of our control measures need to be in good engineering, hydrologic, pollution control practices. It doesn't matter if our stormwater management plan says, hey, we're going to use 12 check dams in this channel. Well, if one of those check dams is inadequate, it's still inadequate because our stormwater management plan said we need 12. And now we've destroyed maybe the first 2, let's say. And so we always want all of our control measures to be adequate. Now, when we look at during a site inspection from the state, that's when we break it down and we look at it a little larger, right? So yes, it would be a finding that it's inadequate, but then we're also going to make determinations on if it meets our enforcement criteria based on those down gradient control measures. So if those of you who have seen our inspection reports, especially in the last maybe 4 years or so, there's a sentence in there always that includes, were there down gradient control measures prior to leaving the site? And so that is taken into account, absolutely. Now, if we have those 12 check dams, I'd much rather see 2 that are full than 12 that are blown out. That's obviously a big difference in how that finding pans out.
Going back
Yeah.
to that treatment train,
Mhm.
if you're, as an inspector, you go out there and in the middle of the treatment train, you see some sediment migrating and the plan didn't call out for an additional measure there, but you think it would be in the project's
Yep.
interest to add one.
Yep, that's,
Behind you, downstream,
Uh-huh.
everything's still functioning properly.
Okay.
Inadequate BMP.
Mhm.
Because you're asking the project to add one at that location.
mhm.
Does the inspector mark that down as maintenance, or do they mark it down as inadequate? It was
Sure,
in
I'm
the
sorry,
plan.
thinking, yeah. Yeah, so the question is, if an inspector is out there and sees that there has been sediment migration, but we know on site, but we know that there hasn't been sediment migration off site, do we need to call out for an additional control measure in there? You know, that's really going to be up to the inspector, who has to be a qualified stormwater manager. And what you're looking at the end of the day is discharge off site. And so if you're all right with sediment migrating on site, but not leaving the site, well, that's your call. Now, there might be other things that come into effect, like the temporary stabilization requirements, things like that. Did that vaguely answer your question, Becky?
The definition of the inadequate was adding a new BMP.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it wasn't in the original drawing.
Yep.
But in the middle of your treatment train right here, you find that there's an addition of a BMP that's needed.
Sure, if it's needed, that's still in our inspection reports. That hasn't
Listed as
changed.
inadequate.
I see. Would you list it as inadequate or needing
But that's
maintenance?
under the annual report.
Ah,
Even though you don't have an offsite discharges and your
I
BMPs
see.
downstream of where you're looking are still functioning.
Yeah.
You're being proactive and calling out for the.
well, I think, if you're being proactive, then you fall under the maintenance criteria. Yeah, if it's a preemptive strike, a proactive approach, and you're not in danger of, right, with our inadequate, it's not in accordance with its design or with the permit. Now, the permit says we just need to keep it on site. Yeah. Did that clarify? Yeah.
But when we're building something and we have limits of construction, but a fence,
Uh-huh.
there's still, say, 20, 30, 40 feet of perimeter that's undisturbed,
Uh-huh.
grass. But it's still part of the site,
Uh-huh.
the overall site.
Yep.
Would that grass or vegetation be considered a control measure because it was pre-existing?
Uh-huh.
And if we breached that, maybe a silt fence or erosion, but and got past that, but we're still on the site.
Sure. Sure.
That's cool.
So vegetation can't ever work as a sole control measure. And the reason is we don't know when to maintain it. And maintaining it is like raking, right? Bringing the sediment back on site. And so we don't have a specification that can tell us, here's when to maintain vegetation, and here's how to do it without causing more disturbance.
It'd be best to maybe put something down at the bottom of the toe of that slope.
Absolutely.
So we're not disturbing it.
Absolutely, yep. And remember too, vegetation serves a great purpose by preventing erosion from what's right underneath it. It just can't catch anything from up gradient. Yeah, great question. Other questions while we're on this topic? Okay, and remember, we'll have plenty of time at the end too. So a couple of things about those corrective actions. So again, those corrective actions are when we had those inadequate control measures. So this is when we're about to have a breach. Next storm, we'd have an issue, and we're no longer in those good engineering, hydrologic, and pollution control practices. So for those situations, the permittee is in non-compliance until it's replaced or corrected. And if we know that it's going to take a bit of time, we want to put in some sort of interim control measure. Or if we know it's going to storm, then that night, and we know we can't get our new silt fence in until the next day, we need that interim control measure. Maybe it's a rock sock that we can lay down a lot easier. Maybe we're rerouting water somewhere else. But we want to stay in compliance with the permit. A couple other things about those corrective actions. I'm sorry, so corrective actions, if you can't do it immediately, what we want to do now is document why. So previously in the permit, we just said it needs to happen as soon as possible immediately in most cases. Now we're saying, well, if it can't happen immediately, let us know why. Document why. Keep a record of it. And there's going to be two things you're going to document there. One is going to be, why is it infeasible? And it can't just be, well, you know, we're on vacation next week. It's got to be a legitimate reason why it is actually infeasible to correct that blowout or whatever the control measure that is that it's inadequate. So we want to describe why, and then also provide a schedule for when it's going to get fixed. So maybe we know that we've got new VTC rock. It's not going to, we're low in some particular county, down in Pueblo, let's say, so we need to wait until we've got a new shipment coming down there. Well, in that case, we want to document what that schedule is going to be in order to get that VTC fixed. A couple other things that are corrective actions. So these are things that, again, you want to be doing immediately. You're going to clean up any contaminated surface. The idea here is if we've got paint, concrete, asphalt millings, things like that, if we've got things that are truly contaminated, we want to be cleaning those up immediately. We're also going to remove and dispose of any unauthorized discharges. So that might be sediment that's made its way into the creek. And that might be unauthorized non-stormwater. So think about your oil, gas, things like that. Obviously, you need to remove of it as much as possible. We know that if we've got a river that's cooking along, we'll never be able to recover it all. But the idea is to get what you can. So moving on now onto our administrative requirements and changes. So kind of how the overall permit's going to work here. So application requirements, same as before. We want that application in 10 days before construction activities going to begin. We have added some flexibility to the permit here, especially given the large number of fires, tornadoes, floods, all that fun stuff that we get here in Colorado. So public emergency sites, so these are construction directly related to public emergency situations. They can apply for a permit up to 14 days after construction activity has begun. So if we need to get in there and fix a bridge that got blown out in 2013, we can get right in there and get started on that.
I assume that, so like last year, we had a situation where up in the Lake Christine fire area, we had to get crews out there to start repairing transmission lines, but I couldn't safely get people in.
Yep.
I did notify, Nathan that we were getting in there.
Yeah. I suppose so. I mean, the 14 days really is in there to give that extra time. And remember, it's 14 days after. Sure. Well, but if they can't safely get in there, then they're not doing any construction, right?
Depending on where, they had to shut stuff down.
Okay, I see.
Getting in there.
Yeah, I would say at least get that application in still. For that piece of it should still get done. Yeah, and I mean, if there's ever times that things are out of the ordinary, reaching out to the division, we'll do what we can with the flexibility available. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and fire is definitely Definitely a big one, for sure, that falls under this point. Second bullet point on here is obviously a really big one here for CDOT. So owner and operator are going to be co-permittees now, and they both must sign the application. And so what does that look like for CDOT specifically? Well, in this situation, what we've got for the owner is the person who has overall control of the activity. The big piece here, funding. Who, not just how much, not like, oh, we're going to take out silt fence here and add straw wattle here and use that funds here. It's, we're going to have this much amount for stormwater or this much amount for stormwater. We're looking at larger funding. Who's really determining how much money is available for the project. And so we also, the second piece here is going to be, we want the party that has ownership or a long-term lease or easements. Yeah?
How does this work with existing permits?
Sure, great question. And we'll touch on this a little further on too. But essentially, existing permits are grandfathered in. So if you currently only have an operator on your permit, that still continues to be fine. Now, one issue that may come up that I really wish I had more information for you all on is if you need to submit a modification for that, I'm not sure how that's going to look yet. We just don't know. Yeah, and that has to do with that online application. But yes, essentially, projects are grandfathered. Yeah.
So we reference in this section the easements. Easements are on private property?
Yes.
What if your project is in right-of-way, which is public?
Absolutely.
And counties and CDOT is not going to want to be a co-permittee with Xcel Energy for a utility project that they have nothing to do with.
Absolutely. And can we maybe talk after on that particular?
Well, I think CDOT.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. We don't. So right of way isn't written into the permit, into the definition. The idea is it then would come back to the funding. So who's making the financial decisions for that part of the project? Yeah, because we really want to be thinking about both pieces, and I think when we're right away, we need to go to that first bullet, the funding.
So if Xcel Energy is installing utilities in the right-of-way, we're funding the project.
Yep, then it would be just Xcel. Yep, and the other thing to think about here is that it's the owner of the activity. That might make it a little better. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry, so the question there was, what about when we're in the right-of-way? I'm going to do this backwards. We're going to answer the question, and then we're going to say what the question was. I'll get better at it. I'm sorry. So yeah, the question was, what about right-of-way? For example, is Xcel going to need to be co-permittee with CDOT for CDOT right-of-way? And yeah, I think funding is the piece to come back to. So looking on the other side then, the operator, so that's the person who has operational control over day-to-day activities. So they can tell people how to meet the requirements of the permit, but they don't necessarily have the money power to say how that's going to be overall done, where the funding is coming from. So that's what we're really going back to here. Remember that the owner can be both the owner and the operator, but an operator will always need an owner. I'll say that one more time. So the operator will always need an owner, but the owner can be both the owner and the operator. Okay? So for CDOT projects that are now in maintenance phase, so the contractor's moved away, CDOT could be the owner and operator. During an active construction phase, we'd have CDOT as the owner, and then we'd have the GC as the operator. All right. I guess before we move, are there other questions on owner-operator before I move on? Yeah.
So the general could be the owner and the permit holder, so he's the owner and the operator.
So the question is, can the GC be the owner and the operator? And yes, as long as you have the money and the authority on the property. Yep.
So you both sign it. You sign it once.
You sign. I don't know yet if you'll need to sign it twice, but I probably. We'll talk more on that. Yeah.
I work for a county government agency. What do you recommend for signing as an owner? Does it have to go all the way up to the chain of command of the
Yeah.
or can it be signed at
That's a great question. We've had that question before as well. So the question is, what about for like county authorities, things like that, work within a county? And the answer is, you want to look at maybe there's like a public works director, maybe it's a Parks and Rec project. Think again about who has the money in order, who can give money to that project. And we would want, if it's like a company, we're looking at like VP status, something like that. Yes, and we will get to that. We'll save that, don't worry. I know, it's super fun. We will get to that for sure. Other owner-operator questions?
Does the state still allow the delegation of authority? So if your vice president is in Minnesota, but they have given delegation of authority for signing legal documents to an individual out of the Democrat
Yeah,
list.
we'll get to that as well. Yeah, we will cover that. Yeah. All right. Excellent. Well, let's keep going here with our application requirements. One thing another piece we've added some flexibility here is previously when we sent in our application, we had to sign off that the stormwater management plan was already completed. Now what we're saying is you need to sign off that it either is completed or that it will be complete before you start construction. So adding some flexibility there. What's great here is, again, county projects often they might, open permits fairly early. Perhaps funding slips through, but they don't want to close the permit. Well, maybe construction doesn't start for 2 years after that permit was applied for. Now we've allowed ourselves that wiggle room to be able to write it when it's more pertinent. And perhaps the project is changing, things like that. Gives us more space. Again, we've got even more flexibility for those public emergency sites. So again, our fires, our floods, our tornadoes. And in that case, we just want that stormwater management plan to be created within 14 days after construction has started. Excuse me. So in this case, for those public emergency sites, what we're looking at is we want to both have the application in and have that stormwater management plan done within 2 weeks after that construction starts. Yeah?
How does that work with BMPs with the emergency sites?
Sure, the question is how does that work with BMPs for the emergency sites? The idea is still that you want to have your control measures in place because there is construction occurring. However, you can always fall back on those definitions of minimize and infeasible because perhaps it's a situation where we can't get silt fence installed because it is a fire zone, things like that. So rely on those definitions of minimize and infeasible. But the idea still is that we don't want to be discharging construction stormwater prior to having control measures in place. Great question. Another change here is that you need to make sure you get written notice of your certification. So previously, if you didn't get written notice and it had been at least 10 days, you were able to assume that you were authorized, and that was the way that the system worked. Now that we're using this online system, you'll get written notice via email that your certification is ready, and that'll be your written notification that you'll get now. If it's been 10 days and you don't get written notification, that's when you want to call our permits unit and find out what's going on there. Just to go over signature requirements a little bit. So we talked about the application. On that, we need that owner and operator. Now, here's where we come, here's some of the ability to delegate signatures. So our self-inspection reports, those can be by our qualified stormwater manager or any of those qualified stormwater managers on our site, as well as that attachment A. That's the one that you see if you've had a state inspection with one of us. It's basically the legal document saying this is our stormwater management plan that we're using. The copy that we give you is the same. So those we don't need the VP, the Parks and Rec director to sign off on those. Yeah.
I do think that there, in the past, I think there was an assumption that they could be delegated.
Uh-huh.
And there's been a lot of recent discussion about Reg 61 and the signatory requirements there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's super important because those don't exactly match what's in the permit.
Okay.
The current CDPS permit.
Sure.
So
Okay.
I think, and I've been involved in some of those discussions.
Yeah.
Where at a minimum it talks about with the city and county that it has to be a district manager or the director of the department responsible for the construction project. Is that going to be put into some kind of guidance for all of us to understand after these meetings are done? Because I don't think it's clear in the permit right now.
Okay. Yeah.
It's been a little bit of a shock for people who have been signing these type of permits
Okay.
for years now that they're not going to be able to be delegated that authority.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I'm not even sure how feasible some of it's going to work for
Sure.
companies like Minnesota.
Okay.
Where I know the intent is for someone to be really responsible. This person in Minnesota is going to be less responsible than a person who's been delegated that authority.
Sure thing. Sure. Yeah.
I just feel
Yeah.
like there is some confusion between Reg 61
Okay.
and these general permits.
Okay.
You can sign them.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'll definitely note that. We don't have guidance document planned at this time. Sorry, the question was, is there going to be some sort of guidance following these trainings on owner-operator issues and the clarity in the permit versus the renewal permit versus the current permit. So we don't have anything planned currently, but I will definitely take that information back to our division and to our unit, and we'll talk over that some more, for sure. Yeah.
I think MS4 permits are one thing. I think these construction permits that we saw, there are 4,000 of them.
Right.
To expect that level of person to be signing off on all of these.
Sure.
May be infeasible.
Sure.
And not
Okay.
promote compliance necessarily.
Excellent. Thank you. Definitely noted. And when we talk on CIOS too, on the online application, we'll go over preparers as well, which might be able to alleviate some of that stress. Just touch really quickly on this. These are our qualifying local programs. So we've got Golden, Lakewood, and Durango. So there might be some folks in those first two here. Nothing big, major changes here. Again, your small construction sites don't need to apply. This is only in Golden, Lakewood, Durango, so only in those qualifying local programs. So your small constructions, 1 to 5 acres. One change that is in this permit here is if there's a requirement that's more stringent in the state permit than in the qualifying local program, then you're going to follow the state's requirement, the more stringent state requirement. Most of the time, these qualifying local programs have a higher standard than the permit, but especially during the renewal process and all that, we're always going to want to make sure we're following those more stringent state requirements. Sale of residence to homeowner, really things haven't changed much here. This isn't necessarily for CDOT folks. You guys don't build too many houses out on the highways. So this is just our residential construction sites. Again, the only change is going to be if the permittee was responsible for either front or back of lot, and one of those hasn't occurred yet, or whichever they are responsible for, then that permit needs to stay open for that site until stabilization's done. And that's just, so it only qualifies if the permittee is not responsible for final stabilization. Transfer permit coverage. This is kind of a neat one here. We added some flexibility in this for sure. Previously, what occurred was if you wanted to transfer a permit, let's say that you were just grading the site, and the next phase that's coming in, the next GC that's coming in, you need to transfer the permit over to them. Well, let's say that they've refused to take on ownership of that permit, but you have clearly walked away, you are done, you've done what you needed to do on it, and you need to transfer. Well, previously, if we couldn't get signatures from both parties, we weren't able to complete that transfer. It resulted in some legal issues, legal battles for sure. Now what we're saying is if you can show us due diligence that you did try to get that signature, then that we will go ahead and terminate the permit. Now remember, if you're the person who's refusing to give the signature and the permit needs to be transferred to you, and now there's no permit, you're now operating without a permit. And so that would be a non-filer issue there. Yeah?
The question is, if we have refused to sign, can we also show our due diligence of why we refused to sign? Doesn't that then put in the role of judge and jury?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, I mean, I have lots of specifications that have to be completed before CDOT will take over that permit. If the contractor just says, hey, I tried to turn this over to CDOT.
Sure.
So I didn't follow any of the stuff they told me.
Yeah.
And then I turn that into you, doesn't that, you're gonna still be in judge and jury.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd have to look in the permit some more for that one. Yeah, yeah, and I'm happy to chat after too, and give you some contact info so that we can talk more on that one for sure. That's a great question.
We can still document loss of operational control. So on a private property easement, landowners refusing to allow access to go in and do certain things, or they don't want us to do certain things.
Sure.
We're not going to take the permit out.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
We've tried to do our due diligence, and all we've done in the past is documented that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think due diligence is that they sent it and the person didn't respond versus they responded and said you didn't fulfill.
It's true.
that.
Yeah, but all they're gonna get
Is one side.
is they're gonna get a letter from a contractor that says, I tried to submit this to CDOT and they refused, as opposed to I blew off CDOT's requirements to fix this and this, and they're refusing.
I can see the concern for sure. Yeah, and I don't know that that's addressed in the permit. I'll have to take another look.
No, it's not about closing the question is, could they close the project? It's not about closing the project. It's about an unscrupulous contractor closing a permit that then puts an unsuspecting CDOT out of compliance, even though there's a.
They won't be able to.
No, he said they can. Well, under this division, you show due diligence, a letter comes in and says, I tried to close this, and they wouldn't talk to me, as opposed to, they wouldn't talk to me because I didn't do what they required me to do as part of my contract.
Yeah.
Guarantees that wouldn't be able to happen, would it? Because the project owner under the new applications, the contractor's never gonna solely hold that permit.
Yeah. So for the folks online, the discussion and the questions are basically in the opposite situation where we can't get, where basically the current operator ends up without saying that they did their due diligence, but CDOT actually can't take on the permit yet because they haven't met the requirements for CDOT. And so I do need to find out more information on that, and I'll make sure that information gets to at least CDOT somehow. But yeah, excellent question, and I don't know that it's addressed in the permit. So excellent point, thank you. Other questions on transfer? Yeah.
Is that still called transfer of ownership? Or
Yep.
transfer of coverage?
It's transfer of permit coverage, thank you. Yeah, because basically, even if you're grandfathered in currently with just an operator, if it's going to be transferred, that transfer will require an owner and an operator. Okay. So this is applying to just existing certifications. So this is where a lot of our questions come up, right? And I've got some handouts here. So if you can help, thank you. You won't need that whole stack, but there you go. So again, keep in mind that the new permit isn't effective until April 1st. And so the current permit, COR 03, is effective until April 1st. We switch over on that day. So currently, you need to continue to comply with the requirements of the current permit until then. Now, some folks are like, oh my God, we already changed our stormwater management plans. Well, it won't make you out of compliance with the current permit. There's only new additions to the stormwater management plans and whatnot. Any updates that you were to make in order to comply with the current permit would still keep you in compliance, or I'm sorry, in order to comply with the renewal permit, still keeps you in compliance with the current permit. You want to submit applications until April 1st under that current permit. So you're still going to submit those paper copy applications, and you'll still get a certification for now under COR 03. You don't need to reapply under that new general permit. So we've already gotten paperwork from folks who had a permit back in 2012 when the permit expired. We got all of that paperwork. We don't need everyone sending in reapplications for this iteration now.
So you won't be sending out verification of records again?
No, we're not doing any verification of records. If you know that your records need to be updated, get that change of contact in. Yeah, and I would recommend getting it in before April 1st, just so everything on your new permit is correct. And then, so since you don't need to reapply, you will automatically be issued a certification under the renewal. So everyone will get those certifications. Yeah.
Will the certifications be mailed out, emailed out?
Sure. Yeah, we will get to that next. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the Colorado Environmental Online Services, or CEOS. And this is our online application that we now have. It's currently working, or I shouldn't say working, it's currently active for dewatering. I know that there's been a lot of issues. I'm happy to hear grievances, and we'll definitely take all of that back to the office. Keep in mind that I'm a messenger here. I didn't create CEOS, and I'm not in charge of it whatsoever. But I will try and tell you as much information as I know about it. And then as questions come up, hopefully we'll keep working through all of it together. Basically, the reason that we went online is, like you saw, we've got 2,400 applications per year. And while our compliance unit received additional funding in order to have better oversight and more compliance assistance, our permits unit did not. And so they are limping along with basically one person who issues all 2,400 of those. And just the process of that really is outdated and isn't serving our purposes anymore. We're not able to keep up with the demand. And so the idea here is, we've got limited resources, and just be able to use those technological tools to help us work faster and more efficiently. So come April 1st, CEOS will be live and active for construction stormwater permits. Like I said, it is currently active for those dewatering permits, and it will become active for stormwater on April 1st. And when it goes active, we'll no longer be accepting any paper applications, any transfers, any mods, or any terminations. Everything is going to be done on CEOS. There will be the option for a waiver, such as there is now for dewatering. Those waivers really only apply in very specific situations. It's not because you don't like computers. It's not because you have an old computer. But it's really those situations where it's a religious exemption. And we're talking like Amish. And then, if we're in a situation where we just don't have internet access for our site. So if we're in an office that does not have adequate internet access, then we can get a waiver for that. I will let you know that I've heard if you want to get a waiver for internet access, you're going to have to prove that you cannot upgrade somehow to have better internet access. Again, I'm the messenger, just saying. We're going to go through just a little bit. These are really hard to see, and I do apologize. So we'll just kind of briefly touch on what we can see in these different pages within the system. So this is your sign-in screen here. You can create a new account, which is right there, the third blue one down. That's where you're going to go in order to set up your accounts. So all the permittees will need to go in and set up an account in there. You'll also want to set up an account if you're a preparer, and we'll talk about that in a minute here too. Also available on this page is your password reset. We've got a couple online tutorials, though we also have some on our website that are a little more specific, and so I would personally depend more on those. And we've also got contacts if things aren't working. So for creating an account needs to be created by a responsible official. And that's going to be the same as your legal contact or your permittee. Now, it has to be somebody who can sign on behalf of the company and agree to any compliance penalties. So in this situation, we're really looking at VP, general contractor, we're looking high up, director of public works. It needs to be somebody who can levy those penalties. So in this situation, we're talking not project managers. Project managers won't be verified as ROs because it's seen as they don't have the financial liability basically on their shoulders. Now, if you have companies, certain companies, where those PMs are given that amount of financial liability, then we'll need to talk through that as we go to register these. But as of right now, PMs will not be able to be ROs. So on the flip side then, if you're not an RO, but you know you want to be able to submit applications, transfers, basically do everything but sign off, then you want to be a preparer. So this is going to be your consultants, your project managers, folks like that. Basically, you can do everything except for sign and submit. So what you'll be able to do in these cases, when we have those folks in Minnesota, they won't have to fill out the application or anything. You'll go through, fill out the application as a preparer, and then you'll just send them, they'll get a notification to electronically sign and submit. So a couple things when you're going through and setting up these accounts, as was mentioned before, you are going to use your personal information for these accounts. Now, a couple really important things here. We are not going to get any of that information. It's all through E-Verify, and so in order to meet the EPA requirements of how we can sign online, you need to be able to verify who you are. And so you're going to use your home address for that process, and you are going to use your social security number. Like I said, we are not getting any of that information. It is solely through the federal E-Verify program. And you do want to use that personal information, though. If you put in CDOT's headquarter address, it won't verify you. It will say you're not you. You need to be using your home address. I have heard that there have been some issues with this. I hope that things continue to get better and cleaner, but do feel free, like I said, to speak up if you know that there already have been issues and you have concerns. Yeah.
I would say have Haley on deep dive when you go to do this.
There you go. So yeah, so there's a couple folks at the division who are specifically working on this. Haley Holiday, thank you, Mary. Haley Holiday is a great one to call for sure, as well as Veronica Kenkel. So if you have specific CIOS questions, they'd be the folks for those. Yeah.
And I've heard that Haley actually has like a little sheet about how to do this, and I'm wondering,
Okay.
and we can all call Haley, but it might be really effective if we could put that on CDOT's website.
Absolutely, noted, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I know like I said, we have a quick guide, but I don't know what Haley has that's different. Yeah. Other questions on this piece, on the ROs versus preparers? Oh, sorry, 1 second, Rebecca. Yeah, back there.
Yeah, just quick, I think I did like the quick online tutorial.
Uh-huh.
In there it said that the application had to be set up by
So I think the difference is if it's an existing facility or not. It was my understanding that a preparer can set up an application for a new facility.
I've been doing a lot of work with existing dewatering permits and new ones, and in each case, whether it was grandfathered in or new one, the RO has associated facility with the facility, which is put the project name, facility name, and then the address. And then the preparer has to go do the rest.
Okay.
That initial step has to be done by the RO, and that's probably quite a bit of wire time.
Okay, all right. So what I'm hearing then, there was the question of does the RO need to set up the application? And that it sounds like the RO does need to set up the facility itself as well as an address and then send it to the preparer, which my apologies, I did not realize that that was how that was working. I did not give correct information previously. Yeah.
I did it for the dewatering side.
Yep.
Will that automatically roll us in?
Yes, so if you are already an RO for dewatering, then you're an RO in the system. Yep. Yep, yep.
Can there only be one RO associated with facility? Or can there be multiple? Like
There,
somebody's retiring and, you know.
that would have to be with a change of contact form.
Okay. So
Yep.
there's just one.
There should only be one until we're creating new permits on April 1st, which will need an owner and an operator. So then there'll be two. Yep, yep. Yeah, and what you'll do with existing facilities is basically everyone's gonna get, if you're a current, the legal contact, you'll get a list, and I don't know if these will be emailed or sent via hard mail, but you will get a list of all of your facilities. And that letter will also have instructions on how to use CIOS. So don't take today as your only opportunity to learn the system for sure. But then you'll use that list to go through and associate. So you'll have to set up your RO account, and then you'll use your list to associate your facilities with you as an RO. And then what you can also do is your preparers, let's say your consultant, is going to set up a preparer account. The preparer is going to let the RO know what the email address was that they used, and then that RO can associate the preparer with the facility. Yeah?
So I've done a couple of the EPA e-notification things,
Mm-hmm.
and they did allow the storm preparer to be the first person and have it be vice versa, so that. But if you could put that on the list, because I do think that is causing heartburn.
Yeah.
Preparers get very good at doing this kind of thing, and then it allows the responsible official to very quickly be able to go in and do whatever they need to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's ask the vice president to go in and sign, to set up a, create that, I mean.
So the suggestion is having a way that the preparer can really do the legwork, and the RO just simply does the signature. Noted for sure. And like I said, I actually had the wrong question. Good to know the two of these systems. Becky, do you have further questions?
No, I
Okay. Yeah, the concern is definitely, we're not gonna get these VPs to set up these accounts.
I have a clarifying question, and
Yes.
the question is, we sort of skipped over it just a second ago about can you have multiple ROs?
Yeah.
Like if you have somebody retiring, so if that's the situation, you have person X, let's say they're the owner, you have contractor Y who's the operator, and then person X retires, so you're gonna have person Z. Do you have to submit a whole new what?
Sure, so the question is, what if somebody retires or no longer is on the project? And it's this change of contact, same as you do now. So that, let's say that I was gonna go out and do an inspection, well, if the wrong contact was currently listed, that would be an issue because the notification was there. So same as now, you wanna update those contacts constantly. And that'll all be done through CIOS.
And that's a form, a click, or what?
Yeah, I believe that, we'll get there. Yeah.
Is the RO
Now, let's say that the owner is the operator, then we just have an auto. Yeah.
You got the brief that I want to go back to. Okay, we're going to get that list back to the new, vice president and appropriate all the stuff. Now we want to modify how we do it.
Yep.
Well, we got to sign that, we need to get up on that.
So if you're going to modify the permit, will you need to pull in an owner? I do not have the answer to that question.
Probably going to need clarification.
I absolutely agree. Clarification is needed on that for sure, and I do not have it. Yeah. Yeah.
So if there are 2 ROs, can either one then set up this initial facility?
Yes. Yes. If there's currently 2 ROs. Right now, there won't be a situation where there are 2 ROs until we have new permits coming. Yep. The existing permits will only have 1 RO. Yeah. Yeah.
So in the situation of private projects, then you're going to have an RO with every new project, essentially, on the owner side. They're going to have to go in, create an account, and go through this.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the question is, come April 1st, will all private projects need an owner? And yes, they will. Yeah. Other questions on this? You guys have great questions. I wish I had all the answers. Telling you what I can. I'm telling you everything I know, I promise that. So a little bit just on how this works, and we won't go into too much detail on these since they're hard to see. But our dashboard here, our landing page gives you basically the 2 options at the top are what you want to think of or look at here. One is to go to your dashboard, which will give you a list of everything once you have it all set up and where everything is at. And then the second point over here is to associate or create your facility. And so that's what we'll be doing initially. The dashboard, like I said, kind of lists out everything that you've got available to you. So pending items would be maybe you've started the application, but it's not completed yet. When we get into our department items, which is the next one down, that's where it's the ball's in CDPHE's court, waiting for that to come back to you. And then your completed items are permits that are up and running. Everything's set, ready to go. We have another option here to associate and create facilities up at the top, just to keep that in mind there. So for associating a facility, once we get into this screen, we'll go on and click that blue button, which is our associate facility. What you want to do is you're going to put in a second. Okay, here we go. So like I said, you'll get an email that'll have your list of all of your facilities. And so what you want to do is you're going to put in, the facility will be pretty clearly identified in that list. Go ahead and put in that same name right into your facility identifier. And that's going to find that facility for you. And then you're going to click Submit down at the bottom there. So like I said, preparers will want to have their own accounts. So make sure that those are set up. The RO will add the preparer using that email address. What else do we have? And as far as once we have things set up, here's where we get into those change of contact forms, modifications, things like that. We're going to click on Action here, and that'll bring us to these additional forms, such as our change of contact, our modification, and our termination. Now, those applications themselves and those forms themselves, the questions are going to look very similar, if not exactly the same, as how they're set up right now. It'll just be an online system. So when we're applying for a new permit, that application is still in process. So we've got it set up now so that we'll be ready to associate facilities that are currently existing. Come April 1st, and we will have it by April 1st. That application will be together. It'll look, like I said, very similar to the current application. It'll just be online. And that dual signature is also still in development, where I assume what it will look like is one person will sign, they'll send a notice to the next person, that person signs, then it gets kicked over to the division once you have two signatures. there will be some way to notify that other signature that the application's ready for them. But those are all, like I said, they're still somewhat in development. Yeah.
Al, if you have to use personal, and I signed up as a small preparer, and I did put in my company email.
Okay.
I didn't have any problems, but I'm also not a responsible official. so
Sure.
I'm not gonna have to put in, I don't know, I haven't gotten it.
Okay.
But I guess I'm wondering, it's one thing to verify who you are, I guess, through, if you're saying it has to be that way, but it seems to me like these notifications, though, they're gonna come hopefully through your company, right?
Yes. You know, email might be the one oddball there. I don't think email.
I think you can put your work email.
You can put your work email.
Other
Okay.
information that needs to be personal.
Okay.
I'm just thinking, like, people might not check their personal.
Absolutely. So the question was, for the personal information, can we be using our work emails so that these notifications are going to the right place? And yeah, it sounds like that is allowable, yeah. Yeah.
From my experience in going through it with Haley's help, the way it worked was the RO sent out an invitation basically associating you or requesting you as a consultant.
Perfect.
At that point, the preparer had access to everything in our company.
Okay.
So I could access everything at that
Okay. So they're able to do the transfers and the mods.
He could assign as little as he wanted to. He signed everything for me on that respect, but he could, like anybody in the company, just sign them to one permit.
Okay. Okay.
It was the way it was set, and it works.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You could prepare everything and then send it back to them.
Okay, yeah, the comment is that it sounds like, at least in one situation, we've been able to set up that preparer who then is, the RO associates with the facility, and then they're able to do those other pieces. And that is how the system should work.
Yeah, anything that the, sorry, just.
Yeah, go ahead.
Really quick. Anytime an RO delegates some sort of work, or vice versa with the preparer, all those notifications are via email.
Okay,
So
okay.
it'll say in your email, hey, RO so-and-so has requested this information for you to input into the application, or whatever they want to do. So it's all via email. Any type of notification that they do, it's all
Okay,
via email.
okay.
Vice versa for preparer or RO.
Okay, okay, so just to repeat there, all of the notifications are via email. So you'll always get emails back and forth. Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, maybe you went over this already while I was writing notes or something, but what happens in a situation where it's not like a retirement, where someone, say, whoever set up the account originally loses their job? Is there a mechanism transferring that at that point?
I don't know the answer to that. That's a great question. So the question is, what if, for example, the person loses their job or something like that, and so we don't have pre-notice, basically, being able to change them in the system? I'm not sure how that will work. I would think, though, that the owner-operator side of that would be able to help, because you'll be able to use the other person. Okay. We're almost done here, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions, definitely. So I wanted to get to what we have for available resources. First of all, we definitely have our, hey Tamara, can I get these handed out, please? Thanks. So obviously our website is a huge resource for folks. We've got all kinds of guidance documents that are either up there already or will be by April 1st. Such as oil and gas, final stabilization, things like that. Obviously, the permit and the fact sheet are always great resources to go to. That permit and fact sheet have everything listed out that you would need in your stormwater management plan, has all of those general requirements, so rely on that permit. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I've got a whole box. Yeah, no, thank you so much. Now, the fact sheet can be a little intimidating because the whole entire document's something like 120 pages long or so. But keep in mind that fact sheet, really, it's the first 10 or 15 pages, I think, that have a lot of the information as to why decisions were made on the permit and how they were made. The rest of that document, so the bulk of the document, is the response to comments. Useful for sure, especially if you want to maybe do a word search to find certain topics. But if you're going to read any part of the fact sheet, read those first 10 pages and don't be intimidated by the last 110. So what we're passing out here now is our stormwater management plan guidance doc. Oh, sorry, yeah.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
About ROs and swamp prep.
Yeah.
Can you have multiple swamp prep per location?
Mary, do you know if you can have multiple preparers on a site?
I want to say yes, but I would have to double check.
Okay, I believe so.
I would think so.
Yeah, I believe so. I feel like,
I mean, I don't see why not.
yeah,
I mean, if the RO is going to verify multiple people for a site,
yeah,
there shouldn't be a limit on that.
yeah,
We had success with the dewatering one.
okay.
Actually, that is true because when we were practicing, we had 3
You're able to do that?
We had 3
Preparers.
for 1 RO.
Okay, the question was, can we have multiple preparers for one site? And yes, there's been success in dewatering and doing that, and that is possible, which that might be a very helpful way to manage the sites. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, let's talk about this guidance doc that just got passed out. Did we have everybody got one? Awesome. Okay, this is a really great document for sure. The entire thing goes through all the different requirements for the stormwater management plan. Quite a bit of detail for each one. There's definitely information on here on inadequate versus maintenance for those control measures. There's all the requirements for your inspections. Goes into detail on the inspection frequencies as well. What I really want to point out here is the appendices in this document. So if you go to page 21, we're at Appendix A there. Now this is all of your stormwater management plan requirement changes. The first part here is kind of your overall general requirements. But if you get on to page, well, even at the bottom of page 21 there, we start to see we've got here the changes that need to be made. So you can use this to go through and update your stormwater management plans. For example, it says under the site maps, to add, you need to add your flow lines, things like that. So that's what that Appendix A is for. Appendix B is also very helpful. This is our stormwater management plan checklist. So this has each of the pieces that you need to have in your stormwater management plan. We send this out before inspections for folks with our notification so that they can make sure they have all the pieces there. So now you've got a copy of it too. Now keep in mind this document is also on our website, so not only the whole document, but also each of these appendices are bulleted underneath so that you can pull a PDF of any of these documents. So then we'll move on to Appendix C, which is on page 29. This is for your control measure specifications where maybe we aren't getting it from CDOT, maybe it's one of the proprietary ones, or it's a special one, or we don't have it in urban drainage, like cut back curb, for example. So in that case, you'd want to go through and fill out this template, which will walk you through what you need in your specifications. And then Appendix D, which is my favorite appendix, is our stormwater management plan inspection. So this is your inspection template. We haven't had one of these previously for the construction stormwater sector. We just started issuing them out for like sand and gravel. And I think it's a huge step forward in helping folks make sure that they are looking at everything that they need to in their inspection template. If you fill this out, you'll know that you're meeting all the requirements of the inspection records. Now, I'm sure that CDOT will continue to have their own form. I don't know what that number is. Paul, do you know the number of the updated form? Will it still be the 1176, just updated? Okay, great. So that inspection template is out there as well. And like I said, we're going to have additional guidance documents available. We'll definitely take into consideration some of the ones that were talked about here today as well. And on that, does anyone have questions? Yeah.
As far as really large developments or in the oil and gas field,
we'll look at it over the long haul. If it's a really large development, it's 10 years.
Yep.
You know, we try to capture all the phases.
Mhm.
But I've heard, it seems like at the state, even when I've asked this question, it's not a for sure answer, not a real definitive answer. So I'm just trying to find out if that's the right way to do it, or if we should only look at the foreseeable future, phase 1, phase 2, and then update it as we go if we have more disturbed acres.
Sure. So the question is on our application, should we be entering our total anticipated acreage of disturbance, or can we do it like in phases? My understanding is for a common plan of development, such as for oil and gas, you want to have that total number on there to begin with. A lot of our oil and gas, they currently have 999 acres listed, and they just cap it at that and figure that that'll do it. Now, if you know over time, maybe the company is really decreasing, supply in that area is going down, you can start to back that off. So if you know that you're going to be down to 800 acres or to 200 acres or something like that, you can go ahead and put in those modifications. But you'd want to start out with your total anticipated. Same as for a subdivision. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kind of on that same line with common plan and development, I really think it's great in the permit that we've defined common plan and development with that quarter-mile rule that I think a lot of us have been using, but just as a rule of thumb.
Absolutely.
But the one thing I think is a little confusing in the definition is it sort of implies that you have to be part of the same building set, development plan using same builder, contractor, equipment, or storage areas. And I feel like what the feedback I've gotten from CDPHE is really this idea of a common, you know, redevelopment project or something that you may not actually ever really know the full acreage of the total plan.
Sure.
You just know you're kind of part of it.
Right.
Even if you're less than an acre, you may not at all have the same plan sets.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Becky's a really good example of that with utilities coming in. But also even downtown redevelopments where you have multiple
Sure.
builders and things. And I guess if we're doing some guidance document, it might be good to define that a little more, because I think some people read it and they're like, well, I wasn't part of their plan set, therefore I'm not common plan.
Great. Thank you for that comment. Yeah.
Am I correct in
Mm-hmm.
what I said?
Yes.
Overall?
Yep. Yeah, it's the idea of, you know, when we have an overall large subdivision going in or an overall oil and gas field, it's that larger common plan. Mm-hmm. But the comment was it would be helpful to have more guidance available on that, and we'll take that back for sure. I think I agree. Let me go back there and then we'll come back to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about the construction dewatering changes. You touched on that way in the beginning, and said something about the low risk discharge.
Yeah.
The ground.
Yeah.
So what was the actual change there?
Sure. So the actual change in the field is nothing. You can still discharge groundwater back to the ground, so land apply groundwater. The only change is we've actually taken it out of the permit because it already falls under our low risk discharge policy. So it was really almost like it was getting double permitted. So the only change is just the permit itself.
So in the case where, I know in the past, if there had been a storm event, and the stormwater entered an excavation, then it's considered a stormwater discharge, not an excavation dwelling. Is that still the case, or is that changed now?
So the question is, if there's a storm event and it fills an excavation and we were to pump that out, that would be stormwater. Yeah. Unless groundwater has commingled with it. But it would be stormwater. If it was dry before it rained, then it would be stormwater.
But if it's commingled, it's still considered, it's treated the same way as it was in the past.
Yes, yes. There's no actual change there. Yeah. Yeah.
On April 1st,
Yes.
you have an active permit, but construction is completed and you're just waiting for grass to grow.
Mm-hmm.
Would the division find it acceptable if you put something in your stormwater management plan that it's not applicable to update the new documentation because you're just waiting for grass to grow?
Okay. What would the example be? Sorry, so the question was, if we're just waiting for the grass to grow come April 1st, do we need to update those stormwater management plans if it's not applicable?
So your little appendix.
Yeah, Appendix A.
You know, if some of this stuff is no longer applicable because active construction is done, we're just waiting for
Well,
grass to grow.
sure. I mean, if it truly isn't a piece of it, but you want to make sure you address it within your plan. So let's say, I'm trying to think of an example that. Sure, okay, there's a great example. The method of how you calculated the percent existing density. I mean, especially if you don't know what that was. If you know what it was, go ahead and update your plan. If you didn't know what that was, I would say that's easily grandfathered in, yeah. Yeah.
Today, I actually just kind of came up with this question when you were going over the concrete washouts.
Mhm.
Because I was thinking a lot of people have details that provide for a liner. If
Yep.
they're within close proximity of the groundwater.
Yep.
Is that going to be counted that you still then can do the buffering? Or are you saying that if you have shallow groundwater, even with a liner, you're just not going to be able to have that excavated washout?
Great question. So the question is for a concrete washout, if you have a liner, do you still need to meet those buffering capacity and shallow groundwater rules? No, if it's lined, you're already protecting groundwater. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Great question.
Hey, Al, I'm getting
Yeah.
some questions from our presence online.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one person would like to know, has the state considered revisiting acceptability of flocculants, like in the case of the sediment basins that you were talking about?
So the question there is, has the state reconsidered the use of the ability to use flocculants in sediment basins? The thing that it comes down to with sediment basins and using flocculants is if you use a flocculant, under our, I believe it's regulation 100, which is our certified operator regulation, any use of flocculants or any chemicals used for water treatment, you then need a certified operator for that site. And so while you can, you would need a certified operator for the site, and you may also be required to have additional effluent limits. So there may be the need for sampling, things like that. So while it's possible, it definitely comes with a lot of baggage.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one more. Somebody would like you to clarify a stream crossing. Is this an ephemeral stream, an irrigation ditch?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so the question is to clarify what a stream crossing is. That would be any state water. So that would include our ephemeral streams, pretty dry creek beds. It includes your arroyos. It does include your irrigation ditches as well. Basically anything that's really going to be channeling and water flows through it, that counts.
Okay, and then last one.
Yeah.
What is an outstanding water?
Sure, the question is, what is an outstanding water? So outstanding waters basically are kind of our pristine waters that we have in the state of Colorado. Like I was saying, it's our headwaters. We really see them only up at the tops of them. They're up in Summit County. They're high up for sure. And the idea of those outstanding waters is that typically permits aren't authorized in outstanding waters. So if you wanted a wastewater treatment plant or something like that, they're typically not authorized at all within our outstanding waters. However, for construction activities, because we know that it's typically a short-term project, and as long as we're following that 7-day inspection frequency, then we are allowing that. Okay. In the back there. Uh-huh. Yeah. Absolutely, great question. So the question was if Appendix C in the Stormwater Management Plan is a requirement or just a tool to be used. This entire document really is a tool. None of the appendices are required documents. And you really want to think about that Appendix C for when you don't already have a specification. So for most of these, especially with CDOT, we already have some sort of spec established. This is, like I was saying, your cutback curb. Maybe you're using a combination of rock, sock, wattle, Filtrex in a different way, or you want to really clarify what that is. It's for your new, different specs. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you discuss borrow or fill sites within a quarter mile of a construction site?
Yes. Question is, can I discuss construction, borrow, and fill sites? So the idea here is that it's really a direct relationship between the two sites within a quarter mile. So the construction site, especially these highway projects, things like that, that fill, they are getting, fill is coming from that site regularly, or fill is coming from other sites regularly. So you can have multiple associated fill and borrow sites.
And so what is my responsibility as an owner for that fill site when I have not gotten a contract with the owner of the fill site? I don't have any direct money. I have only said to my general contractor, obtain fill, or obtain
I see.
dump.
Yeah.
I have zero financial or contract with the property owner. So what is my responsibility as an owner?
So the question is, what's an owner's responsibility regarding fill and borrow sites, especially when the contractor is just told to get fill, and there is no direct relationship with the owner there. I think we need more clarification on this still. I don't think I have an answer for that one. I think that would be a great thing to include in that guidance document on common plan of development, and that we do need more clarification from the permit on what that means. Yeah. Let's go over here. Yeah.
The idea of the distance mean that anything further than that just needs its own separate permit then? Or?
Yeah, fill and borrow sites. So if there's like mining occurring, then that would need a sand and gravel mine. But for the most, yeah.
If it's a 2 miles from the site or a quarter mile or whatever.
Yeah. Well, the common plan, really, I think the idea here, to be honest, was to include within the acreage. It wasn't so much control measures and all of that over the fill and borrow sites. I believe the idea was what had to do more with the acreage, so that you were including those fill and borrow sites within your total acreage. But let me find out more on that, and let's get some guidance out on that. I agree that more clarity needs to be had there. Yeah.
And sorry, very much on the same vein of that question, I think where CDOT probably, but also municipalities, when they are bidding out their capital improvement projects, they often put it on the contractors to obtain staging areas.
Yeah.
Even these temporary asphalt or batch plants.
Yep.
They often, so and where that gets really tricky is that the project owner of the project is, one entity, but yet I think that owner, just in a very similar manner, if they work out a staging area with, but then I also know that if they work out a staging area with a private owner out of the right of way, that person is probably not going to want to sign either.
Sure.
And then with these batch plans too, and there's a real big push now to get them out of CDOT right away a lot of times.
Okay.
So then I think we get into this weird place, and I see it from both the county and city municipal side, because they also often tell the contractor they have to find their own staging area. But I think we all agree that that should be in stormwater compliance.
Yep.
So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think now that we have these co-permittees, it makes it an even harder question.
Yeah.
And to continue with that vein, I didn't, as an owner, CDOT, I didn't contract with that property owner. The contractor did. I did not give the contractor money and say, go to this property owner and get an owner. The contractor, on their own, found their own staging area because right-of-way is limited and we have site distance, clear zone areas, and this is an area for you on the project site to stage. So, and then to further complicate as a CDOT, I have my own right-of-way. I can't go into the city and county and Denver's right-of-way and tell them what to do and how to do it. I don't have any legal authority over the property owner and the contractor, because I don't have any contracts. Private property owner, whether it's a project staging site or a borrow or fill.
However, I would also argue somebody needs to be responsible for staging areas and compliance areas. So
Absolutely.
I don't know what the answer is.
Yep.
Do you see this as an issue with the neighborhood?
Absolutely. So the question and discussion has to do with staging areas similar to borrow and fill sites. And so again, let me find out more information. I'm definitely going to bring back to my team that we need some guidance on common plan of development and these borrow fill sites and these stabilized storage areas, as well as asphalt and batch plants. And just the issue of contractors are often the ones who are engaging with those parts of the facility, and so the owner really doesn't have responsibility over that. So I will take that back. Yeah, Paul.
The new CDOT 10725C spec is out for review, and it does cover that. We clearly say we will not be owner in anything outside our review.
Okay. Okay. So that the comment was that CDOT's new spec says that they will not be RO for anything outside of their permit boundary. And so we'll take that into account when we work on that guidance document as well. Yeah.
Al, real quick, we're on batch plants, so like concrete and asphalt batch plants that are on, so like I work for CDOT, so like batch plant that's on CDOT right away, are you gonna treat that the same as we did before? So like we have a giant permit that covers our entire footprint of our right away.
Yep.
Batch plant sitting on the right away, who holds its own industrial discharge?
Yeah, nothing's changed there. So the question is, if a batch plant has their own COR 900,000 industrial stormwater permit, will anything change? No. If they have their own permit, that's still separate.
So then the swamp administrator, or whatever we're calling now,
Qualified stormwater manager. Yeah, I know, right?
So that person would just go ahead and note on their site map.
Exactly.
Permit that overlaps on that you would.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. So the question was, then do we just include that information on that batch plant in the stormwater management plan, which is correct. You just say, this area here is essentially outside of your permit boundary. Yeah. Yeah.
Quick question on the annual reporting requirement of non-compliance items. Can you point to, I don't see that, I might be missing it somewhere either in guidance or requirements.
Yeah, I would have to dig around and see where that actually is. I believe it's in part 2. Page 27, thank you. Which is part 2, correct? And so there's been some question on what this annual reporting is going to look like at the end of the year. I don't think we have a definitive answer on that at this point. So again, that's something we'll need to get more information out to everybody about.
It's number 7.
Perfect, thank you. Yep. Yeah. And we have to make a determination still as a division if that's going to be, are you just going to let us know if you sent in spill reports? Or is this going to be every instance of non-compliance, so every corrective action that needed to occur? And we don't have an answer on that yet. There's a question back there.
So can you just briefly describe what the contractor will be doing once it receives this permit on the going digital accounts? Will they have to do it right away, or is there some timetable that they'll be expected to have it done?
Yeah.
Account set up and coordinating it with the CDOT?
Sure. So the question is timing and scheduling. Basically, is there a time frame or a gap of time in order for all of this online sign up and everything to occur. Unfortunately, the only answer I have is that it's going live on April 1st and that things need to be done that day. Now, I see some concerns with that. So I definitely hear your concerns, and we can hope for the best. No, I think overall, I'm really pushing, and I've heard from a number of these trainings, if we can get some way to get into the system and get all the facilities associated, you know, the 2 weeks before or something, that would be fantastic. So I'm going to continue pushing for that. Yeah, Mary.
And I just want to point out, too, that we're also holding another training like this on Wednesday at our facility, and the person that's basically in charge of all of the CDOT stuff, she's going to be doing her own presentation as well. Everything's going to be recorded, and we're going to end up putting it on our website. So if you guys have, she's going to be the one to really speak about COs.
Yeah.
So I would think sometime next week, Wednesday's presentation will be on the website, so you can kind of do a little section.
Great, thank you. So just to recap that, so we'll be doing this presentation again on Wednesday at CDPHE office, and the woman who's in charge of setting up CIOS essentially for us will be giving this portion of the presentation even extended, and she'll be there to answer questions. And also that will be available online. Yeah.
So I have a question about the gap that this gentleman back here was talking about.
Yeah.
Is there a timeout, like if CDOT entered a permit as an owner, is there a time, like, oh, sorry, it got erased, and because you don't have the operator signature? For instance, oftentimes in our process, we clear a project for environmental, and it takes up to 3 months for that contractor to go through the award process, the bid process, etc. And so we, as part of our environmental clearances, do the permit at the time of the project going to advertisement, and then 3 months later we transfer the permit the old way to the contractor.
Yep, yeah.
So can a permit sit in the CIOS system for several months without the operator to complete it?
The question is basically if we have something set up in the CIOS system, will it disappear if there's been no activity and the application has not been completed? So far as I know, you can set up whatever you'd like in there, and it should stick around. Now, I don't have a 99.9% answer, but that's my understanding, is that a preparer can go in and set up 20 permits that may not come down until later in the line. That's my understanding. Yeah.
Going back to where they can cancel or terminate a permit without transferring it and provide documentation.
Yeah.
Due diligence.
Yep.
Is there a plan in place, or should there be a plan in place? Maybe you went over this, to notify the other party. I guess there was a concern, about.
Yeah.
That happens, so you let them know they need to pull their own permit or to refute.
Well, I believe so the question was basically, if there's going to be a transfer and that signature hasn't been sent in, is there some sort of notification that due diligence has been performed? I believe what I've heard when this question has been asked before is that the notification is that you've asked them to sign it multiple times. That part of the due diligence is you have to be able to prove that they've received the email, the certified mail, something like that. And so their notification really is you trying to get them. Now I will find out more on the larger question. Yeah. Yeah.
So earlier on you said that stormwater must flow to at least one control measure. So say you're talking about a project, say for example utility install, like
Yep.
Small areas of disturbance.
Yep.
That break the 1 acre requirement.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about an area where it's like flat land, maybe like a 30-foot
Yeah.
area, are you still expecting to see models and so forth?
Sure, great question. So the question is, if we have a really small area of disturbance, like a utility, or maybe we're doing multiple small locations, are we looking for, and in flat land, are we looking for control measures? So the answer there is it depends, right? It always depends. So basically, if we have, like I was saying before, vegetation can never be our sole control measure, right? But if we've been able to come up with a specification for our particular area that can show, okay, it's small enough in size, it's flat enough, there's enough, we aren't seeing signs of erosion, so that we have like a specification for it, then that sort of thing can be worked with. I've seen it before where it's like a vegetation and topography specification, where it uses all these different factors together to show that that is adequate. But we're really talking about, small area, small amount of slope, non-erosive soils. It's got to be a pretty robust specification there. Yeah, great question. Others?
Do you have
Yeah.
an existing certification that was entered in with just an operator, not an owner? Will the new transfer into the new thing just put it into the owner?
That's my understanding, yeah. Yeah. Or it will list it only as being an operator, but it will be okay with that. Whichever way they make it work. But you will be grandfathered, yep. So the question was, if you're an existing permit, will you need, in the new system, will it just show the operator, if you only have an operator, as the owner? And either it will show it as both, or it will not require that owner. Yeah. All right, well, excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. If you have individual questions, do let me know. Thanks for your time. Sorry we didn't take a break. I realized it was much longer than 2 hours even.